That's the reason why.
Oh, seriously? I think you got your badge. Oh, yeah.
Today we are honoring the memory of George Marshall Clark.
From all accounts of his life, was a young man who was very well liked in the community. His father, George, was a barber. He was apprenticing as a barber himself. This was a young man who was in the early years of his adulthood, who probably had great dreams about what he wanted to do with his life.
A young man who was killed by a lynch mob in brutal fashion after being accused of a crime that he did not commit. At some level, it sounds familiar, right? As we think of Breonna Taylor, or Tamir Rice, or Dontre Hamilton, or even Jacob Blake. But as horrific as each one of these instances were, at the hands of authorities, there's something even more terrifying about an entire mob searching you out, dragging you from the authorities themselves, and setting out to murder.
But make no mistake, this problem was not solved a couple years after George Marshall Clark's murder with the Emancipation Proclamation, or by the passage of the 14th Amendment, or by the civil rights legislation of the 1960s.
Now, can you imagine being a Milwaukeean at that time, being a city that had celebrated a group of citizens who went into Milwaukee to free a black man who had been wrongly jailed in the Milwaukee County Jail, a story that we all celebrate. A story of abolitionists coming to Milwaukee, breaking into the jail and freeing a black man. Yet, just a few years later, a different group broke into that same jail with completely different intentions. They broke into the jail because of the confluence of events between either 4 or 6 individuals. On September 6th, George Marshall Clark and a good friend of his, Mr. Shelton, James Shelton, were walking down the street. Now, some accounts say that they were accompanied by 2 white women, and they came across 2 white men in town. And the way the story plays out is that these 2 white men were not happy to see these 2 black gentlemen accompanying 2 white women. And the racial animus that existed in Milwaukee at that time led these men to say some very ugly things to George Marshall Clark and his friend James Shelton, which led to a fight. And this fight unfortunately ended very badly, with one of those white men being stabbed, and he died the following day.
Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees.
We think of lynchings oftentimes in this country as being precipitated in a lot of the stories that we've heard in our history classes, that somehow black men caused their own lynching. They did something that led them to be lynched. And when we think about lynchings were extra legal violence. This means that the person did not have the benefit of having our criminal justice system do its job. A mob of people in Milwaukee decided that once George Marshall Clark and James Shelton were incarcerated in the jail, they were going to take the law into their own hands. And the police department did nothing to stop it. They did absolutely nothing. They knew that it was going to happen. A mob of 300 people came to the county jail. The sheriff at the jail that night did the right thing and said, I'm not going to let you in this place to take these men out, because they weren't there to lynch George Marshall Clark. They were there to lynch George Marshall Clark and James Shelton, both of them. The sheriff did all he could. He was actually hit in the head and was knocked unconscious. They broke into the jail. James Shelton was able to find a place to hide in an adjacent cell, which saved his life. George Marshall Clark said, I have no reason to hide. I didn't do anything. I'm not guilty of any crime. I have nothing to fear because I did nothing wrong. The mob didn't care. As they were dragging him out, beating him, kicking him, they didn't listen to his words saying, I'm an innocent man. I'm not guilty of this crime. I did not kill this man. It didn't matter. Even as witnesses along the way, as they were dragging him down the street, said, you have the wrong man. That's not the right man. You have the wrong man. They didn't care. They took the law in their own hands and they murdered in a brutal fashion George Marshall Clark and left his body hanging for several hours. We don't know who took his body down. We think his family probably came along and cut his body down. But it left a stain on Milwaukee. A stain that we are here today to try to wipe away. This stain has not been in our history books. This isn't in our local history classes here in Milwaukee. Students in Milwaukee don't learn the story of George Marshall Clark's lynching. It's time we start teaching all of them that, beginning today. We want to put a human face on George Marshall Clark because he wasn't a lynching victim. He was a young man who was murdered in a brutal lynching, but he was a human being. And so often we think of lynching victims as just that, as that moment in their life, as if they had never done anything prior to that moment. We forget who they were before that. Let's think of what we're doing for George Marshall Clark tonight, not being a celebration of the fact that we're acknowledging this lynching, but that we're celebrating his life that was ended by that lynching. It's important for all of us to recognize how rare this event is in Milwaukee. We don't do these types of things in Milwaukee. We don't talk about the ugly parts of Milwaukee's history, right? How often do you see organizations that work in silos in Milwaukee, and we talk about Milwaukee being a silo community, how often do you see organizations coming together, as Forest Home Cemetery, America's Black Holocaust Museum did, with the help of this just phenomenal young man here.
To Brother Tyrone Randall Jr., thank you for raising our collective consciousness about this particular story, about this particular event, about this particular individual. The legacy of George Marshall Clark, you have called us here to make sure that we are responsible to that history and to those narratives and to that history. Thank you very much.
God of our silent tears, thou who hast brought us thus far on the way, thou who hast by thy might led us into the light. Keep us forever in the path, we pray.
I just want to say thank you for everybody for coming today. I did not expect as many people to come out, and kind of stirs me a little bit just to see this many bodies out here that care about the education behind this, and about the future of the state in the city, the future of the black bodies, the black boys and girls in the city who don't know about this stuff. But I'm also at a place where I know that this work's not done. There are a lot more black figures who have done great work, who are still left unnoticed. And I think that is something that needs to change. It's something that is important for black kids to have heroes to look up to, especially in this city, where we're worse demographically for a lot. You wanna grab them?
So we bless this marker as a sign that George Marshall Clark's life had meaning. And so are the lives of other black and brown bodies whose lives have been taken all too quickly from us. But we also acknowledge for ourselves that the charge for us this day and what we have heard and saw on today, hear this charge. Whenever we settle for the way of things and are instead of the way you would have them to be, forgive us. when we are paralyzed by fear or limited in vision, increase our trust in you. Whenever we offer charity but fail to work for justice, show us the most excellent way that our love requires. When we tire of the struggle, restore our hope. Whenever we forget those who have gone before us or act as if we were the first to follow in the way, allow us to recognize our arrogance. We are witnesses in this space. Encourage us to dream and work toward the building of the beloved community. Ignite within us fires of creative compassion to sustain our connection with each other and confirm our kinship and all creation. Amen.
Away, God who has by thy might led us into the light. Keep us forever in the path